Toronto. Paul, can you hear us?
Sure can. Morning, Bruce.
Good morning, and Bonnie. You're on brunch with Bruce and Bonnie live from Centrepoint in the heart of suburbia, Ottawa, Ontario.
My favorite Sunday morning show. Perfect.
I know it's your favorite. It's the only Sunday morning show nowadays.
That's right.
Paul, I'm going to get right to it. You were a formidable opponent in the court. And there's some part of me thinks that you left because I kind of hammered you a little bit far too often in the courtroom battles. But you were a formidable opponent, and it didn't mean you were a slouch. It meant you were an honorable guy, but above all, you were fair and you were bright. You were sharp. And speaking to you about this, Bonnie and I have been very impressed about some of your views about, we're coming out of this, how we're going to come out of this, and whether we were ever in this together. And you got some views about government, some views about what society should be reflecting upon as we emerge post-COVID. So tell us your views.
Yeah, well, thank you. Hi, Bonnie. How do you?
Hi. Nice to meet you.
Well, thank you for the kind words. So hearkening back to sort of what led you and I, as a defense lawyer and as a criminal prosecutor, be able to go head-to-head in battle with ideas for a number of years on a number of cases. The reason I think, Bruce, you and I could do that and then step outside of the courtroom and still be friends, and still are friends to this day, probably comes down to one big, simple factor, which is we both had a very strong respect for the process of the court. Right? I think you and I both understood that we both played a really, really important, critical, and necessary role in how the court system operated. And in order to get the right results in court, you've got to protect that process. So you taking a run at one of my, prosecution witnesses, you coming into court and asking for a lower position for one of your clients, never bothered me personally because I understand that was your job. You were getting paid to test the evidence, and you understood that I had a burden as a crown to prove something on a reasonable doubt. And I think likewise, Bruce, you can correct me if I'm wrong, I think you appreciated the fact that if you came at me with a low position, I'd tell you to get the hell out of town, and I'd say, no way. And I think you understood that I was going to call every single witness and cross-examine the hell out of every one of your witnesses vigorously, because you understood that I had a role, which was to try to prosecute this case within the boundaries. You'd agree that all that's fair?
Absolutely.
And so let's take that model and let's apply it to what's gone on right now. And I think as we reflect upon the last 8 weeks, I think we as a group of citizens have a question to ask of our government and of ourselves, which is forget about the outcome, forget about the decision that was made. That's the outcome. Let's ask ourselves about the process. How was this decision made? How was this narrative told? How was it relayed to us? How were our lives governed? And I think asking that question, going after the process, is one of the most important things we can do going forward. Because I think it'll be way too easy to just say, hey, the government told us what to do. They made some decisions. It sucked for a while. But look, the light switch are going to come back on. We'll go back to normal. I think the question we need to ask ourselves is, how was that decision made? Because how it was made will govern how it's going to be made going forward. And I think that's the most important thing.
So what did the government do or not do, in your view, that was problematic? And are we all in this together? And I'll very quickly, hello from Joanne Malash, former Crown Attorney in your office with you.
Yeah. Well, and my hello's back. Yeah, so again, going back to this model, it fits back again to criminal law, because it's a good metaphor, I guess, to use. Why is it that in criminal law, when it's someone that sort of the proverbial everybody knows this guy is guilty, why is it that we don't just proceed straight to sentencing? The reason we do that is it's not about making a decision that in any case we want, we can go ahead and just arrive at the judgment. The whole point is in every single case, regardless of how guilty we think somebody is, we have to go through the process of testing evidence, cross-examining, and ensuring rights are protected. And the reason that we do that on 9 out of 10 cases where most people sort of know what the result is going to be is because on the 10th case, we don't know what the result is going to be. So applying that back to COVID. So ask yourself this question. What evidence did the Canadian government rely on before it made its decision? And who was testing that evidence? What was the reliability and the credibility of that evidence? So who actually made the decision? Was this a decision that was directed by the WHO? Was it a decision that was directed by the Prime Minister alone? What was the level of testing of the evidence, and what was the level of transparency around that? So why is the court process, again, back to our profession, why is the court process open? It's open because we've made a decision as a society that we want that to be open to the public, because we want the public to know what's going on, because that protects all of our rights. So I found it a bit rich that, Justin Trudeau wouldn't go ahead and disclose all the information that he had to the rest of us. It's a little bit paternalistic to say, look, I have the information and I'll make the decision for you. So where is the evidence coming from? What was the level of transparency around it? What was the level and the rigor around the testing of the evidence? I think you then have to ask yourself, how many different opinions did we get when we were assessing the evidence? So what was the level of bias of who was providing us the information to tell us what decisions to make? What level of say did we as a people have in it? I'd say we had a pretty low level, if any, to say. And who were the people around the table making the decision? And at what cost did these decisions come? Right? So again, it was really easy in this case to tell us all to go home. The message was really simple: go home, save lives. We're in this together. We're in a fight for our lives. Go home and save lives. But what would we have done as a society if the actual medical requirement to prevent a pandemic was something more extreme than sitting on your couch and watching Netflix? So what would society have done if the test was, hey, we figured out that this thing's transmitted through pets, so in order to save lives, we have to euthanize all pets? Would the Canadian public have been as compliant? Would we have demanded more of our government? And if the answer is no, what does that say about us? And if the answer is yes, we would have demanded more of our government, then why didn't we demand more? Because we essentially euthanized a huge part of our economy. So again, I think the question really comes down to what's the process around making the decision, and how much can we trust our government in that process, and what can we as people do in terms of testing that process?
So I assume you're not really happy with the manner in which both federal and provincial governments have handled this whole thing.
No, and I'm sympathetic to the fact that, and I understand this idea that, better to make, a moderately correct decision under duress than to wait for a perfect decision and miss the window. So I understand the notion of time constraint. But if you actually think about what's occurred in the last 8 weeks, the last 7 weeks in our society, I mean, to say it's unprecedented is the understatement of the year. When did you ever expect you'd be told you can't actually work, and you can't actually leave your home, and you can't actually see your children? And I know you say, well, I got to see my kids because I live with them, but my parents didn't get to see their kids, right? A lot of parents who are sort of our parents didn't get to see. Like, we separated families, we prevented them from working. There are millions of Canadians who will never recover from this financially. And so when I look at it, I say, yeah, we had to make a decision relatively quickly, but what was the process around making that decision? I don't know. I've read lots. I think the government's been a little bit cagey about how they made this decision. I think the government's been a little bit cagey around the narrative they told everyone. So, you and I spoke about this, I think, last week. I find it a bit rich that the government stands up and tells us all to go home and take a wicked, wicked financial haircut. So, I'm in the fortunate position of advising a ton of businesses from across the country, and they are all hurting and they are all suffering. And yet they're all working harder than ever. They're not sitting at home with their feet up on a desk or feet up on the couch. They're working harder than ever to try to keep the lights on, and they're doing so for less money. And our government's telling us, look, we're all in this together. We're in this fight together. But not one single MP in Canada offered to cut their own salary down. And I find that a bit rich. It's a little bit paternalistic and a little bit like, we're the elite. We have all the answers. We're not going to tell you how we're going to make our decisions. We're listening to the medical experts, and we're telling you that you need to go and suffer for this. We're all in this together. But I didn't find the MPs were financially suffering the same way we were. And I think that begs a lot of questions too. And I think it's important to think about that as we go into the next round of this, because there'll undoubtedly be a second wave of COVID. And if there isn't a second wave of COVID, there's going to be some new pandemic at some point down the road. And I just think we need to walk away from this lesson saying, hey, let's test the process a little bit more and let's cross-examine things more.
So if you were the head honcho, moving forward from this moment on, what would you say or do differently?
I think there should have been more transparency around the information they had and more transparency around the decisions they were making. And I understand that governments are reluctant to do that because when you open up your books a little bit, you invite more criticism.
But what kind of transparency? Like, what do you think that we're missing? What do you think that they haven't told us?
Well, who is the driving force behind this? Like, where did we get our information from, and who were the people testing the models?
Well, I was assuming that it was the medical doctors who were giving the information and telling the Trump government what to do. They were advising them.
I mean, here in Canada, who was the person testing all the models? Who was the entity testing all the models? And why did they change so frequently?
Right, we have no clue. And I think
I think they change frequently because, to be honest, the medical field didn't really know what they were dealing with. So that's why it changed.
But who was testing them? Like, who in the Prime Minister's office was actually doing them?
right, we don't know.
Okay, so that's one. So number two, what was the source of the information? So if you actually look at the information when it came out and it first came out of China, I find it really rich that we were relying on numbers from China to help establish some of the numbers in the chart. And then all of a sudden, when things hit mainstream media and all of a sudden this thing hit the West, the Chinese numbers got really dodgy really quickly.
My cousin,
that I agree.
Paul, my cousin Cliff Prupus out of Toronto says that we relied on the information from the World Health Organization.
Okay, and so how reliable was that? And was that enough? So we have a body that's far away from us that may not have Canadian interests at heart, and we're relying on that. So if I'm in a leadership position, and we're all in that position, whether it be on a micro level with our own families, our own offices, our own staff, and our own citizens, and certainly you're in that role as the leader of a country, are you going to rely on the WHO to tell you what to do in your country? Or are you going to test that and say, look, I'll take your views, I'll take your data, and I'll juxtapose what's right for my own nation?
Well,
That's sort of one issue, right?
You know
the next
what?
one is, how many other voices did you have at the table? So I'll give a great example. I had the pleasure once of being a business consultant to a gentleman who was running a large enterprise. And I'll never forget sort of sitting at a boardroom table with this gentleman who was a developer and sort of involved in a lot of his businesses. And he was at a table with all of his advisors. And this issue came up and a problem to be solved. And I saw him go around the room and hear from everybody on this issue. And lo and behold, the litigator at the table thought like a litigator, and the CFO thought like a CFO, and the accountant thought like an accountant, and the corporate lawyer thought like a corporate lawyer, et cetera, et cetera. And everyone sort of went around and said their piece. And then he was able to come back, hear all this different information, juxtapose it with his overall values and mission and what mattered most. And he made a very, very sound decision, not having just listened to one entity in the room. And so one of the things that I don't think we know as Canadians is how many other voices were there at the table. So I think, Bruce, you and I spoke about this, but if we were only listening to epidemiologists and virologists as to how to solve this problem, that's not a very prudent approach for a government, because we are a multidimensional society and we are linked in many different ways. So was there somebody at the table advocating on behalf of poverty? On behalf of people who are going to be impacted by the poverty that unopted? Was there anyone at the table advocating on behalf of mental health? So was there someone at the table who said, look, run the numbers, you're going to have X amount of deaths if you let this thing run its course from COVID, but if you shut this society down, you're going to have X amount of mental health issues, and that's going to lead to an increase in suicide, right? The New York Times ran a story recently that said global starvation will probably double in the next year due to the breakdown in the food chain, in the food supply chain. So that's approximately 100 million more lives. So that's a lot more lives than we're back to do. I'm simply saying the process mattered. And I don't think the process here was transparent. I don't think it was rigorous enough. And I don't think it was multidimensional enough.
Very quickly, Paul, in the remaining minutes we have, one of my solutions would be, like you say, who do we turn to? And, if we have to go to the World Health Organization, which has ties to China, which is completely untrustworthy, why don't we have our own CDC? Now, we do have the Public Health Agency of Canada, which is, I think the funding is dwarfed by the CDC out of the USA. But why not take money from these useless government departments that exist, and I can think of a few of them, and devote them towards our own CDC. So if something like this happens, and when the next one happens, we can be ready and have reliable information and have a source that is, like you say, reliable and transparent.
Yeah, and I would take that even one step further and say this. I think one of the big takeaways from this, and it'll really be telling how our government responds to it. And again, the devil's in the details, right? I think there's a ton of institutions across our country that need to be revisited following that. So, I mean, our conversation first began at the fact that every single person was told, we're in this together, we're in a war, but if we're all suffer together and we individually do our part, we come out of this together. And yet the suffering hasn't been done together. So most people have taken a wicked financial haircut. Obviously businesses have, but you're an employee, you're living in Brampton, you and your wife both had jobs, and you earned $80K a year, and that's how you provided for your family and your house and your 2 kids. And all of a sudden, your business is ordered shut down, and so you're now collecting $2,000 a month as opposed to the $4,000 a month you were getting before. So your income just got cut in half while you have a mortgage and 2 kids. Meanwhile, MPs, number one, didn't join us in solidarity. The Prime Minister of New Zealand took a pay cut. The Mayor in Halifax took a pay cut. There's been a call for Canadian MPs to do it, and not one has volunteered and said, I will join you in this, and I will donate 25% of my salary towards the stimulus package or towards charities that need it. Not one. And there's been calls on them to do it. There's a petition out right now that I think has over 30,000 signatures from to do it, and not one has done it yet. That begs the question: why do they think that they're sort of above it all?
Well, you certainly have given us all a lot to think about. But I just want to, before we end, I just want to take this on a lighter note, because I was fascinated by the fact that you're a Crown attorney and at the same time have such knowledge about family and health and all that stuff. So I wanted to ask you what knowledge you had about speaking on the empty nest syndrome. I ask because obviously Bruce and I are empty nesters, and a lot of the people that are listening to the show are empty nesters. So, we've been alone before the COVID started, but it's even harder now because we can't even see our kids at all. So, but what were you speaking about with the empty nest syndrome?
Oh, well, I'd love to see you guys fill your house up by babysitting my kids for me during this time. That'd be okay?
Sure, anytime. Anytime.
Over. They're really, really good at cleaning. They're hardworking. They do wake up very, very early. That'd be okay?
Anytime.
So, no, I think what I was saying, the reference that I gave earlier was, imagine if for a moment, and people are going to say, well, this is a very extreme view, but I think you have to take things to the extreme in order to test the process. Right? And this goes back to what I said sort of the criminal law. Bruce, you and I know, because you could never admit it, we were working together on a case, but very often we knew that you were defending somebody who was guilty. But the reality was we'd still go through a week-long trial to test every shred of the evidence. Because maybe he was guilty of something, but not everything. And even if he was guilty of everything, you can't just read in the police synopsis and say, there you go, I'd like to proceed to sentencing. The whole point of how a society functions is these processes are the pillars that keep us safe and keep us protected. And so imagine if for a moment the next pandemic that comes has a nexus, a medical nexus between people who are over 30 and people who are under 10 transmitting to one another. And the government came down and said, anyone who's 10 or below and anyone who's 30 or over can't be in the same room. But don't worry, the government's here to solve your problem. We will take all kids who are 10 or below, and we're going to take them up to camps north of the cities with government-trained counselors, and you'll get them back in 8 to 10 weeks. Save lives, send your kids to camp. What would we have done? Right? And you might say, well, that's an extreme example, but I don't think it really is. We separated, senior parents from their families. We separated, people of your vintage from their parents. So the government has just proven itself in the last 8 weeks that it's going to make decisions, and it's going to make them in very, very sweeping measures. And we've just proven ourselves as Canadians that we're happy to be compliant and go along with that.
Paul, sorry to interrupt you, but you know what? I can go on forever. We got under a minute to go. We're going to get cut off. But look, I mean, we can probably have you on. You can probably host your own show. You don't even need us.
It's true.
And I'll tell you what, you want to run for Prime Minister, you got my vote. I think you have all our viewers' votes. And we're talking about 1,000 viewers that are going to be tuning into the show, either live or watching the recorded version. But before you leave, I want to thank you for this. And I want to apologize because I remember that trial that my guy got acquitted, and I objected to a question you were about to ask. And I think had the judge, sustained and allowed you to ask that question, you may have won. So I want to apologize for kicking your butt there a couple of years ago.
No problem. I was going to say earlier, I know your wife's listening, and I'm sure your kids are as well. I know you said that you think the reason I walked away from Crowning to head into business and other areas was just because of the defeat. You don't know this, but Bonnie and I spoke earlier. She had given me a call a couple of years ago. She said, hey, look, Bruce keeps coming back with this tape. Keeps coming home with his head down and between his legs. This Attia kid keeps kicking the hell out of me in court. And so she actually called me. She said, "Would you mind doing me a favor? My husband's a bit older than you. I'd like him to sort of have like a nice chapter of some victories. Would you mind stepping out of the Ottawa courthouse for a couple of years and letting Bruce have a chance to gain his confidence back?" So as a courtesy to your family, and so Bonnie, thanks for that call.
Thanks for.
And Bruce, when you want to step down or your confidence get high enough, I'll step back.
I'll take any win I can, Paul. Thank you.
Bye, Paul.
Thank you both.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
See you guys next week. Mother's Day.